My name is Joao Santos. I'm a PhD student from the MIT Portugal program on sustainable energy systems from Lisbon. The title of my presentation is Useful Exergy is key in obtaining plausible aggregate production functions and in recognizing the role of energy in economic growth. And I will present a case study for Portugal between 1960 and 2009. I'll start with the motivation for this work, focusing on the role attributed to energy resources in contrasting approaches to economic growth theory. I won't go into detail like Quentin did. And also the appropriate way to account for energy inputs to the economy using the laws of thermodynamics. I'll detail the methods of my analysis, which is based on cointegration analysis, and also the definition of a set of criteria, allowing us to interpret cointegration relationships as statistically significant and economically plausible aggregate production functions. I apply this to Portugal. I'll show you the results and the conclusions we've obtained. So going back to the beginning, in the most basic of neoclassical growth theory, capital and labor are the factors of production, but the two alone are insufficient to fully account for historical economic growth in most developed countries. You need an exogenous component, often called total factor productivity, technological progress, which is treated as a residual. As for energy, it's either absent or assumed negligible or not as important as the other resources, as capital and labor. Basically due to several assumptions, namely economic output is corresponded with the sum of payments to the factors of production, which are virtually exhausted by capital and labor. An historically observed stylized fact for the economy is that in the long run, the shares of payments to capital and labor are approximately constant. Capital receives about 30% of income, labor the remaining 70%. And finally, a cost share theorem equates each factor's productive power with how much it receives in payments in total income. So the small payments attributed to energy, when they are reported at all in national accounts, justify the small role attributed to energy in the most basic of neoclassical growth theory, which leaves this kind of theory struggling to justify economic crisis resulting from energy crisis, for example. And I'm not going here into the extension with exhaustible resources, which has other issues, as Quentin discussed. In the ecological economics literature, the role attributed to energy is a more central role, because the economic system is seen not as closed or isolated, but as embedded within a larger environmental system, exchanging materials and energy with that larger system and obeying the laws of thermodynamics in these exchanges. There are several works in the ecological economics literature that include energy as a factor of production alongside capital and labor. In doing so, they are somewhat able to reduce the residual term. Some even manage to fully explain economic growth without the residual term, also attributing to energy higher productive power than predicted by its cost share, and going so far as to suggesting minimum energy requirements for economic production and economic growth. Now, another criticism found in the literature targets the neoclassical concept of the aggregate production function. Namely, this criticism is based on what the authors call aggregation issues. The conditions under which you can aggregate across micro-level production functions to have an aggregate production function are so stringent that makes you doubt the validity of the aggregate production function concept itself. Basically, what these authors argue is that the aggregate production function is merely capturing an underlying accounting identity between the variables, not a behavioral relationship which can be statistically refuted. And that explains the very good fits obtained with the aggregate production functions. What you usually see is simply the assumption that an aggregate production function can be written between your economic variables, and then taking it to empirical data to obtain a good fit. But if you are capturing the underlying accounting identity, that's maybe meaningless. Another aggregation issue is related to the famous Cambridge capital controversies regarding the aggregation of, in this case, capital inputs from heterogeneous assets of capital to have an aggregate measure of capital. So in our methodology, we try to address this criticism somewhat, and you will see that in a moment. But now, discussing the role of energy inputs to the economy, it's important to have the appropriate metric to account for those energy inputs. And the metric we adopt is that pioneered by, among other authors, Robert Ayres, which is a useful work or useful exergy metric of energy flows. So we measure energy at the useful stage of energy flows in the economy, not the primary energy contained in natural resources, for example, coal, not the final energy after the transformation in the energy sector, and sold to final consumers, the electricity generated from coal, for example. But we are interested in the fraction of that final energy, which delivered to an end-use device is actually used to perform the final function of that device, which has economic value, the actually productive function of the energy. So in terms of electricity, the electricity you supply to a light bulb, useful would be the light emitted by the light bulb, which has economic value, unlike the heat dissipated by that light bulb. Now, in thermodynamics, energy is a conserved quantity, neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. Different forms of energy have different quality, and summing up across different types of energy must be done in the way that they are comparable. So there are different ways you can try to define energy quality. I'm talking here about a fundamental way to define it, which is basically the amount of work that energy can generate. So in thermodynamics, exergy is a concept defining the amount of physical work that a system generates as it reaches thermodynamic equilibrium with its surroundings reversibly. So the exergy content of energy is a measure of its quality. The same quantity of electricity, let's say 100 joule, and the same quantity of heat do not have the same quality because you can convert electricity completely into work, physical work. You cannot do the same with heat because of the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law. So the useful exergy metric allows us to measure energy at the stage where it becomes productive to the economy, while still being measured in physical units, joule, and allows us to account not just for its quantity, but also its quality. There have been several studies on individual countries and groups of countries regarding useful exergy accounting in the long run. For Portugal, this has been done in the past 150 years by a former colleague of mine, André Serrain. One of the more interesting results he found was that throughout these 150 years in Portuguese history, there have been dramatic shifts in the Portuguese economy, as well as shifts in the way in the consumption of energy in the Portuguese economy. Despite that, he found that the useful exergy intensity over this time period is surprisingly stable. It's almost always approximately 1 unit of output, economic output, corresponds to 1 unit of useful exergy consumed. This is not verified when you look at other energy metrics, such as final exergy, for example, which has decreased substantially in the same time period due to advances in efficiency. Excuse me. This close relationship between useful exergy and GDP is the motivation for our work, my work, and it's more clearly visible looking just at the last 50 years. The difference here from the last graph, I know what you're thinking, is in those last 50-year period, we have, since André's work, we have adopted a more appropriate price deflator for GDP instead of what he used. And you can see the close relationship between useful exergy and economic output. So our motivation is to look more closely at this relationship between the two and attempt to formalize it mathematically using econometric techniques. I use cointegration analysis because it allows me to find a statistically significant linear stationary relationship between non-stationary time series, which is generally the case in macroeconomic variables and the energy consumption variables. There is a humorous example in the literature of cointegration analysis, which is by Michael Murray, where it's about a drunk and her dog. I don't know why it's a woman, but basically both the drunk and the dog, for different reasons, follow random walks. They are non-stationary variables. The best way to predict where the drunk will be in a moment is where he is now. You cannot rely on a constant mean or constant variance. But if the dog belongs to the drunk will not want, neither of them will want to stray far away from each other. The drunk will periodically call the dog, and the dog will bark back as a reply. And so they can adjust their steps so as to not stray away from each other. So they introduce an error correction mechanism to their previously random walk, and they are said to be co-integrated. You can now use the dog to better predict where the drunk is in the next moment. So what we do is test for cointegration between our economic variables for outputs, inputs of capital, labor. Is it? Oh, sorry. Were you showing the 5 minutes? Okay. I was scared for a minute. Showing for economic outputs, inputs of capital, labor, and energy. We use the Johansson methodology to do this, which requires all these time series to be integrated of the same order. We know for capital that due to its construction, it's likely to be integrated of a higher order. So we adopt a set of working variables instead, where they're defined as the ratio of the output and inputs over labor, and taking the logarithms. This also allows us, when we are interpreting the relationships as production functions, to impose constant returns to scale. Now, I'll walk you through the models we are considering. So starting with the simplest model, just two working variables for output and capital. No linear time trend included. At most, there will be one cointegration relationship between these working variables. If that is the case, it can be written as such, normalized to the output variable as such, lifting the logarithms and multiplying by labor on both sides, you get a formulation of this cointegration relationship, which resembles very closely a Cobb-Douglas type aggregate production function. But just because it looks like one, it doesn't mean that it is a production function. That's why we introduce the following set of criteria for statistically significant and economically plausible production functions. 1, there must be cointegration relationships. 2, the output elasticity is estimated, the exponents must be positive and statistically significant. There must be Granger causality linking the inputs to economic output. And if you want to take this function to the empirically observed stylized facts of cost shares, the estimated output elasticities should resemble these cost shares. Then we can play around. We can include the energy working variable. The thinking is the same, subject to the same criteria. We can remove capital and have just energy. Now, this is not an economically plausible production function, likely, but it gives us a better idea of a more direct relationship between the energy variable and output. We can include a linear time trend, which will be representing the total factor productivity term, or the exogenous residual. And then we can have, this is an interesting case we can have in our analysis, which is with 3 working variables, we can have at most 2 cointegration relationships between them. When this is the case, we can write them as such. We can normalize one of them to the output variable, having a production function with just capital and labor. The second relationship is linking all the factors of production. We can normalize to either one. We choose capital because of the way capital is measured. You will see that in a moment. We measure energy and labor in physical units, such as hours worked and joule. The capital measure uses monetary units. And so this can give us a better approach to the real utilization of capital in the economy, probably as a function of energy and labor. So the application to Portugal, this is the data we've used. Output is measured as gross value added. For each factor of production, we have two alternatives: a quantitative only measure and a quality adjusted measure. For capital, this means the monetary value of the stock of assets versus the services provided by these assets. For labor, it means total hours worked by engaged individuals versus taking into account a human capital index. And for energy, it means the primary energy supply versus our useful exergy metric. And now for the results. The first two slides I'm going to show, all the models include a linear time trend in their specification. These are the simplest models with just two working variables. Here they are not written as such. They are already showing all the variables that go into the production function formulation. In most of these cases, we find no cointegration. So this is giving us a tool to statistically refute the existence of the production function as such in these cases for the Portuguese economy. In those cases where we do find cointegration, they reject other of our criteria, such as those related to the output elasticities. With more variables, we see a similar picture. None of these possible production functions accepts all of our criteria or satisfies all of our criteria. So for the Portuguese economy, it doesn't seem that there is a production function Cobb-Douglas in type with a linear time trend. The next two slides, the time trend is dropped. Here we find much more cases, that's incorrect, but okay, of cointegration between the variables. We still get a lot of rejection on the other criteria related to the output elasticities. With models with more variables, we never find a plausible model where energy is an independent factor of production alongside capital and labor. But in the models where we have at most two cointegration relationships, we find this which we deem our winner. This is a model which satisfies all of our four criteria. It's a model where you have a very neoclassical-like production function, a Cobb-Douglas with output elasticities resembling the cost shares, the average historical cost shares for capital and labor. But energy is present in the second simultaneously valid cointegration relationship. And capital utilization is better proxied by as a function of the labor required to manipulate the capital, but more importantly, the useful exergy required to activate it. So this is just an expansion of what I just said. It's the output elasticities are similar to the average cost shares. So in this, our winning model, we have no linear time trend, no residual. We include capital, labor, and energy inputs, all of them quality adjusted measures for these factors of production. And we have the two cointegration relationships which are simultaneously valid and gives us more than just the neoclassical Cobb-Douglas capital labor production function. So just to finish with the broader possible conclusions, the adoption of the useful exergy metric allowed us to achieve these insights to the relationship between energy use and economic output. We end up with a model where there is an important role for energy as a factor in capital utilization, but that doesn't necessarily ruin the cost share theorem of neoclassical growth theory. The work I've just presented has recently been accepted to ecological economics. It should soon be published, and we are thinking of course, expanding this to outside Portugal, very important. Open up to more complex formulations of the production function, other than the Cobb-Douglas, which is simplistic in nature, but it's the easiest one to use, especially with our cointegration analysis. Additional variables to include in the cointegration space, and also more robust statistical testing of the restrictions to this cointegration space. So I finish by thanking these institutions and leaving my contact for any questions, and open to questions now, of course.
There are some questions. So, Robert Iris, since you were challenged.
Yeah, a quick question. It's very plausible that capital should be a function of energy input, but why not labor?
That's the yeah. We could have just as easily normalized that second relationship to labor, and had labor as a function of energy. That is true, and that was one of the issues of the reviewers of the paper. We didn't we w- we weren't able to give them a straightforward answer because frankly we normalize it to capital as an intuition. It is a relationship between the three inputs, so it's a constraint relationship at most between the three inputs, but the normalization is open to discussion, of course. Capital seemed to us the worst measure, so to speak, of the three factors of production because it's not based on purely physical units. So we went with that, but obviously it's an hypothesis.
Yeah, Zainab Karaman from the Shift Project. It's just a curiosity, but is there any explanation, like economical interpretation, when you drop the time trend, that you find the cointegration, like there's more cointegration than when you do not include? Sorry, when you do
That
include it. Yeah, sorry.
Well, we think that it's telling us that um, it's not required to have the error correction model. So it's not there. Our model ends up not needing it
Okay.
with just the. I know I'm not making the right. I'm not
Yeah, because it's curious
expressing
to
myself
find
well.
it, like when you include that there's no
Mhm.
cointegration, but you don't. When you drop it, that suddenly you can find a cointegration.
That
And why don't you use the model then without the time trend? If you found the
I do.
Okay.
Meaning
But finally, what you interpret, it's like two models,
yes.
while you don't put the energy in the first output model, and you put it in the capital model.
Okay. So the two relationships we get.
Yeah.
The first one links output with two of the other factors of production.
Yeah.
The second relationship links the three factors of production without output, just the three
Okay.
variables together. They're two separate relationships.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, that's why we need to test further for restrictions to the cointegration space, because we may be, it's again the question of normalization. We may be able to write the production function not with capital and labor, but with energy and labor and so on. So that's why we need the further work on that to test that.
Yes. Roland Sabot from CA Cadrach. Your model is more or less up to the world crisis in 2008, in which or at the time where Portugal in the recession, and with a drop of GDP and a drop of energy consumption. Have you tested your model in this down part of the curve? Between after 2008 up to, I don't know, in the decreasing part?
No,
because if you have something which is robust, it should also be applied to reproduce the down part of the GDP production and the GDP consumption.
Exactly.
That Portugal experience in
this
that
analysis
time.
goes up to 2009 because that was the length of useful exergy data we had. We now have more data on useful exergy accounting, which is not easy to do, but we have extended that to 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and we are going to use that extended time series to run this again, but we haven't done it yet. We are still finishing that extension of the useful exergy time series, which is what's constraining this limited time period.
Okay, thanks, Oliver Richters again. Thanks for your excellent talk. I have two questions. First, given that you understood that the cost share theorem is problematic for various reasons, why do you take it as a criteria for a good model? And can you explain the 5% or 10% cost share of energy from your model? And the second question is, so you have this formula for K, which includes L to the -2.
Mhm.
Why do you think that's plausible? Because given that if you take this formula for K and put it into the production function, you will get what you call implausible exponents. So I'm not quite convinced that this is really a good model, but I'm looking forward to your your answer to that. Thanks.
Okay, so the first question was related to the. Remind me. Sorry, I have the worst memory.
Cost share.
Okay. Well, it's a good question. We weren't going to do that at first, but we did it sort of like we might as well have the Cobb-Douglas that gives us the neoclassical Cobb-Douglas, so to speak, but with the extra relationship. And when we did that, we find that it worked. So it's not that the other models are incorrect just because of that, but with this model we obtain very good fits to historical data while still satisfying the cost share theorem and having energy with an important role. And we found that very interesting because the two were not a priori inconsistent with each other. And this, I'm not sure that that answers the
The
question.
-2 exponent.
The -2 exponent, well, I don't have a good answer for that. It's again, the second relationship is a constraint on the factors of production. Not necessarily capital utilization, like I said, but if you normalize it to capital, the more labor, if capital and labor are substitutes, the more labor you have, the less capital you need. Not the case in the useful exergy in the same relationship. The more useful exergy you, the two work as complements in that case, capital and useful exergy. That can be a possible interpretation. I don't have a good answer, but it's a good. That's why it's a good question. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Joao.